Good morning. My name is Anurima Bhargava. I served as the former chair and currently serve as commissioner at the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF. For those of you who are not familiar, USCIRF is an independent, bipartisan US federal government body created by the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, or IRFA, to monitor religious freedom abroad and to make policy recommendations to the President, Secretary of State, and Congress. Thank you for joining us for our event today on democracy and religious freedom. Next week, on December 9th and 10th, actually this week, the Biden administration will host the first Summit for Democracy. The summit will focus on the challenges and opportunities facing democracies, including promoting respect for human rights. With this summit coming up in just a few days, USCIRF wanted to explore the nexus between religious freedom and democracy in two of the world's largest democracies, India and Indonesia. A cornerstone of democracy, the freedom of religion and belief, is experiencing significant challenge in both of these countries. The governments of India and Indonesia have increasingly adopted and employed laws and policies to hinder the freedom of religion and belief and to target religious communities. Persecution of minority religious communities is also on the rise, including violence, harassment, the destruction of houses of worship, detention, and even death. I am joined today by USCIRF Chair Nadine Maenza and Commissioner Khizr Khan, who will speak further on our concerns regarding religious freedom in India and Indonesia, respectively. We will then hear from our panelists, John Sifton from Human Rights Watch and Professor Robert Hefner from Boston University, who will provide insight into the intersection of democracy and religious freedom in these two countries. I will moderate a conversation among the speakers with some opening questions. Then there will be time for questions from the audience. To ask a question, please use the Zoom webinar's Q&A function at the bottom center of your screen. Submit your question in writing, which you can do at any time during the event, starting now. It is now my pleasure to turn over the floor to Chair Maenza.
Thank you, Commissioner Bhargava. I'd like to extend a heartfelt thank you to our distinguished guests for taking the time to speak with us today about Indonesia and India. Freedom of religion or belief, as Commissioner Bhargava mentioned, is an important element of democracy. However, even in India, the world's largest democracy, freedom of religion is increasingly at risk. India's trajectory is deeply alarming in a diverse, secular, and democratic country whose constitution protects religious freedom. Since 2020, USCIRF has recommended that the State Department designate India as a country of particular concern, or a CPC, for engaging in and tolerating systematic, ongoing, and egregious religious freedom violations. USCIRF is deeply concerned that the Indian government continues to promote and implement policies at the national and state level that impact religious freedom for members of India's Muslim, Christian, Sikh, Dalit, and Adivasi communities. These policies include the Religiously Discriminatory Citizenship Amendment Act, or the CAA, which provides fast-track citizenship to non-Muslims from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. The CAA, in conjunction with the government's proposed National Register of Citizens, or the NRC, requiring residents to provide proof of citizenship, could subject Muslims and others to statelessness, deportation, and prolonged detention. The test implementation of the NRC in the state of Assam is proof that such policies contribute to a climate of hate, intolerance, and fear, which is the antithesis of a pluralistic and democratic society. State-specific anti-conversion laws, intermarriage restrictions, and anti-cow slaughter laws have also contributed to the climate of fear and the deterioration of religious freedom. In recent years, there also has been an alarming closing of space for civil society in India, which has further curtailed religious freedom and related human rights. Members of civil society in India, including human rights advocates and media reporting on religious freedom violations, face ongoing intimidation and harassment. Government officials use the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act and other statutes to silence critics and detain advocates, media, and academics, including religious minorities. In September 2020, the government also amended the Financial Contribution Regulation Act, or the FCRA, to further limit engagement in support of non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, especially religious and human rights organizations. In recent years, government officials have revoked or suspended the FCRA licenses of thousands of NGOs, including numerous Christian and other religious and human rights organizations. A vibrant civil society is vital to protecting freedom of religion or belief. As civil society monitors and advocates for this right, seeks accountability for violations, and delivers services to marginalized religious communities. The Indian government's crackdown on civil society has hindered these activities, which in turn undermines both religious freedom and the country's democratic system. I'll turn to my colleague, Commissioner Khan, now to discuss USCIRF's concerns regarding religious freedom conditions in Indonesia.
Thank you, Chair Mainza. I apologize for this technical difficulty. And Commissioner Bergava, thank you. I would like to reiterate our gratitude to our distinguished guests for taking the time to speak with us today on this important subject. As we speak, countries around the world are teetering between democracy and authoritarianism, with some regressing to the latter. The strength of democracies is in the emphasis they place on human rights, and religious freedom is a fundamental human right. In 1998, following the resignation of Suharto, Indonesia began a process that is still unfolding, a transition to democracy. The majority of religious freedom violations in Indonesia occur at the local level, where minority faith communities such as Ahmadiyya Muslims had their houses of worship closed down by local authorities, or Christian communities have been unable to renovate existing faith centers. However, the legal tools that these local actors utilize are the result of the central government maintaining and in some cases expanding laws that violate international standards of freedom of religion and belief. Blasphemy laws such as Article 156A of the Criminal Code, the 1965 Presidential Decree, and the 2008 Law on Electronic Information and Transaction have allowed for an unfortunate explosion of blasphemy allegations in the democratic era. To make matters worse, it appears that the Indonesian government is poised to expand blasphemy laws in an updated criminal code that it has been working on since 2019. USCIRF has consistently and strongly advocated for the repeal of blasphemy laws, as these laws violate freedom of religion and expression, two mutually reinforcing rights that are essential to a functioning democracy. USCIRF has called on the US government to work with its partners in Indonesia to remove those articles that would further violate international standards, such as those dealing with blasphemy. And of course, the autonomous province of Aceh remains a hotbed of religious freedom violations, where a strict interpretation of Sharia is enforced without the ability to opt out. We have been concerned with conditions of religious freedom in Indonesia since 2003. And in our 2021 annual report, we reiterated our recommendation to the Department of State to include the country on its special watch list. Thank you. And I will now turn it over to our first distinguished guest, John Sifton.
Thank you very much. And thanks for holding this important meeting. It's a bittersweet experience for me, given that Human Rights Watch has struggled for years to bring religious freedom violations in India and Indonesia to the attention of US policymakers. And we're glad to see it getting more attention and very much appreciate the Commission's recommendations in the last 2 years about India and Indonesia. But while we're glad of that, the reason it's bittersweet is because in both countries, we have seen a deterioration in the human rights situation writ large, but with respect to international religious freedom in particular. And it's frankly disturbing to witness as it unfolds. In India, we've watched as local and national government officials have increasingly used toxic rhetoric to describe political opponents, minorities, religious minorities in particular. And we've seen how that rhetoric has translated into actual kinetic violence against Indian nationals who are killed, lynched, burned, stabbed. People have died because of this rhetoric. We're not just talking about words. We're not just talking about discrimination, although that is a problem. We're talking about actual violence against religious minorities. I don't need to run through it. I think the Commission's own report has made clear what the particulars are. Our own reporting has made it clear. There's been an increase in discriminatory laws. There's been an increasing formation of what I can only call paramilitary or vigilante groups, so-called cow protection groups that are meant to punish people for unlicensed slaughter of cows, but in reality go after religious minorities and sometimes kill them in the name of protecting cows. We've seen increasingly problematic legislation. We've seen the revocation of key autonomous provisions in Jammu and Kashmir. And all of this has led to a worsening environment for religious minorities across the country, not just in Jammu and Kashmir, but from one end to the other of the country, Christians, Muslims, Dalit in particular, have faced the brunt of this increasingly toxic atmosphere. This dovetails and overlaps with an increasingly toxic atmosphere simply for people who are opposed to government policies or who criticize government officials. And it's important to recognize this, the overlap, and recognize that religious freedom isn't just about religion. It's a barometer for a larger tolerance or lack of tolerance towards differing opinions in one's society. And very sadly, what we see is in India, the ruling party has fostered an atmosphere in which only Hindu nationalism is a supported ideology, and anything else is considered anti-nationalist, anti-Hindu, anti-Indian. And that's a problem because, as the commissioners have pointed out, we're about to have in the United States a summit for democracy. And while it's not meant to celebrate the democracies who are invited, but rather foster a dialogue among them, we have to recognize that it bears the risk of suggesting that everybody who is invited to the summit is somehow better and blameless, that somehow being a democracy means that you have a good form of governance and you have no human rights problems. On the contrary, the opposite is the case. Almost every country in the world has human rights problems, democracies included. And it's important to emphasize, as all these democracies gather, that the largest among them have major problems. And while they do still retain democratic values and democratic institutions, there are major illnesses and major problems in these countries. And religious freedom is a barometer of it, probably one of the biggest in the case of India, as well as in Indonesia. But I raise all this because it's important to recognize as these countries gather that just because you have a democratic institution as a form of governance doesn't mean a political party can't poison the atmosphere and create a situation in which religious minorities don't feel safe and are at risk. And the risk in the end for India, as well as for Indonesia, is that the toxic rhetoric that the ruling party is presenting, and which is turning into actual kinetic violence against people, becomes a permanent state of political reality. And you end up with not so much a democracy, but a one-party state in which anybody who challenges the ruling ideology is silenced or intimidated, and in any case is unable to attain any form of political power. And then you have a spiral, a worsening spiral of violence and intimidation, where the lives of not just religious minorities, but minorities in general, and critics, and anybody who is opposing the ruling party becomes more and more silenced. The question now is, okay, in my last few minutes, what is the United States government supposed to do about it? India is a very large country. It's a very long ally of the United States. It's not going to simply snap to the fingers of the United States government, nor does the United States government have the moral authority to simply preach to others what they should and shouldn't do. The Summit for Democracy is a dialogue. The relationship between the US and India is a dialogue. The question is, how can the United States best use that dialogue to promote religious tolerance in India? And the only answers to that question, which Human Rights Watch can offer, are that the United States can foster its economic and political relationships with India to urge the government towards a more tolerant a way of being. When President Obama visited India many years ago, he raised religious freedom issues. He encouraged European Union leaders and G7 members to do the same. Did it have an impact? I'd like to think so, in the sense that the BJP and Prime Minister Modi, when they see fellow heads of state raising questions about the political atmosphere in their country, it has an impact. It has an impact. And the hope here is that by continually raising these issues on a public level, that the Prime Minister will instruct his party, not just his government, but his party, to put a lot of this toxic rhetoric in check and to embrace a more tolerant, pluralistic model of governance. Will they believe it? Ultimately, it doesn't matter. The hope is that the Prime Minister, recognizing that the toxicity of India's political environment represents not just a political risk, but an economic risk, a security risk, will instruct party leaders and government officials to put the toxic rhetoric in check. It's really the only hope that we have. So the recommendation of USCIRF is welcome. I am frankly not optimistic that the State Department will, adopt these in coming years when they decide what a country of particular concern is, but it doesn't matter ultimately, because the message has been sent. And I believe the current administration now better appreciates how toxic the atmosphere is in India. My only last recommendation is for members of Congress to use the occasion of the nomination of a new ambassador to India to really press the new ambassador to be vocal on these issues and to not simply bury them in diplomatic niceties, but be willing to raise them when he speaks with his Indian counterparts in government. I'll leave it at there. Thank you very much for holding this hearing. I'm happy to also discuss Indonesia in the questions and answers period, a country that we also work on quite a bit, but the other panelist is going to address. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. So let's turn it over to Professor Robert Hefner from Boston University. We really appreciate you being here with us. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank USCIRF for holding this very important and timely event. As Commissioner Khan noted in his opening remarks today, Indonesia is the most populous Muslim majority society and democracy in the world. The country returned to electoral democracy, a vigorous electoral democracy in 1998-99 in the aftermath of 32 years of authoritarian rule. Now, there were interesting developments during these early period of this transition. During the first 3 years of the transition in particular, Indonesia witnessed fierce outbreaks of communal violence, often of a sectarian nature, and pitting Christians against Muslims, especially in the eastern provinces of Indonesia, where those two populations live side by side with roughly equal numbers. Some 10,000 people perished in this early transition violence, and more than 1 million people were displaced. Since there were warnings at that time, and I attended many events in Washington, D.C. during those early years when Indonesia was being compared to Yugoslavia with expectations that the country would break up. It didn't. Since that time, however, the country's leadership, not least the current administration, has made what I would regard as significant progress towards reducing outbreaks of this type of violence. And I'm referring very specifically to large-scale communal violence that has diminished dramatically. That said, beginning around 2004 and 2005, there was a notable uptick in the second type of violence, smaller scale incidents of attacks and intolerance, typically against religious minorities, including Muslim minorities. The targets of these acts, the most common targets of these attacks were Shia and Ahmadi Muslims, who represent a very small percentage of Indonesia's 87% Muslim population. Ahmadis living on the island of Lombok were the target of some of the worst acts of such violence. High-ranking officials in the Ministry of Religious Affairs, many of whom I know personally and whom I regard as principled and high-minded Muslim Democrats, and I will say that very strongly, denounced these outbreaks of large-scale violence, and such incidents have diminished significantly in recent years against Ahmadis and Shias, but they have not stopped entirely. All this said, to move on to a third dimension of the transition, another consequence of Indonesia's return to democracy in 1998-1999 was the implementation of one of the most far-reaching programs of state administrative decentralization any country in the world has seen in recent years. Although the program was advised by US agencies and sought to bring the state closer to the people, an unintended but very significant consequence of the decentralization program is that it provided incentives for local, not national, but local politicians in several provinces, including Aceh, West Java, and again, Lombok, to reach out to sectarian conservatives in local society and rally the public once again, most commonly, against Ahmadis and Shia. As someone who has done research for more than 40 years in Indonesia, I would note that these acts of what I might call sectarian trolling have largely been limited to a minority of Indonesia's provinces. Compared in particular to some of its Southeast Asian neighbors, I would suggest that the national government has made significant progress at containing populist sectarianism of this sort. However, the decentralized nature of the state administration and the raucous nature of Indonesia's very open and freewheeling democratic elections guarantee that local state officials in several provinces, in particular 6 or 7 of Indonesia's 32 provinces, have shown much less restraint. As the USCIRF report on international religious freedom has noted with regard to Indonesia, although actual outbreaks of violence have been far fewer, discriminatory acts against Christians have also taken place in Indonesia, again, in particular in 6 or 7 provinces. In the province of Aceh, which Commissioner Khan referred to, we have seen significant numbers of Christian churches closed while in West Java, another province notable for its sectarian tensions, in West Java, in West Java, we have seen restrictions placed on the building or renovation of churches. In all these cases, discriminatory practices have been driven not by national parties or by Jakartan officials, but by local politicians' efforts to sectarianize for personal political gain, and it has worked. The most serious of these incidents of sectarian trolling was the well-known campaign in 2016-2017 against the Chinese Christian governor of metropolitan Jakarta, Basuki Cahayapurnama, who's referred to often as Ahok, a blunt-talking but hardworking and popular governor who had once dreamed of being Indonesia's first Chinese-Indonesian president. Governor Ahok fell afoul of Indonesia's blasphemy law when, in the course of a small campaign rally in September 2016, he made some offhanded remarks about the Quran and non-Muslim leadership of Muslims. Captured on videotape, the statement was quickly edited in a fabricational way and uploaded to YouTube by Governor Ahok's opponents. This led to 3 huge rallies against the governor, as well as his electoral defeat and prosecution and imprisonment under blasphemy laws in 2017. Many observers of Indonesian politics and society regarded the anti-Ahok campaign as the beginning of a downward turn in matters of religious tolerance in Indonesia. In my view, events since 2017 suggest a far less dire, but still complicated picture. Religious scholars and leadership in the mass-based organization Nahdlatul Ulama, which has some 70 million followers and makes it the largest Muslim social welfare association in the world, the leadership of Nahdlatul Ulama has taken great efforts to defend Indonesia's Pancasila variety of multi-religious pluralism. Surveys have shown, including surveys that I have conducted in the Muslim community, that even within NU, not everyone agrees with the leadership's pluralist efforts. Indeed, surveys indicate that probably the majority of Muslims do not agree with non-Muslim leaders like Governor Ahok exercising authority over Muslim populations. So there are uncivil currents, if you will, in quote unquote civil society. But the NU's initiative is nonetheless significant, not least because NU scholars and leaders have sought to justify their initiatives with bold appeals and very detailed appeals for far-reaching reforms of Islamic jurisprudence, or fiqh, on matters of citizen equality. These have caught the attention of Muslim intellectuals and leaders around the world. They are significant. No less significant, Indonesia's democratic-minded network of state Islamic university systems, among the most liberal-minded and democratic in the entire Muslim world, have developed textbooks and curricula for religious and public schools in Indonesia that underscore the compatibility of Islam with religious tolerance and multi-religious or multi-confessional citizenship. This is significant, notwithstanding the fact that such programs cannot restrain irresponsible populist politicians. They are making a difference. Last paragraph. Another example of the incremental progress on religious freedom in Indonesia was the very significant 2017 decision by the country's constitutional court to extend state recognition to indigenous religious communities not previously recognized by the Ministry of Religion. Although, yes, the decision stops short of extending full equality to the practitioners of indigenous religions, among whom I might know I have worked. It is a hugely significant change, and one that many human rights activists regard as a hopeful harbinger of future progress on religious freedom. In sum, my last sentence, although some observers fear that the campaign against Governor Ahok in 2016-2017 was the beginning of a downward slide away from equal citizenship and tolerance, there is evidence to suggest that both state and society have made significant progress over the past few years on matters of religious freedom, albeit in the face of occasionally strong populist headwinds. The greatest threat to religious freedom in Indonesia is actually not the national government, but irresponsible and typically locally based populist politicians. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Hefner, and I apologize for the background noise. Both of you have provided such invaluable insight and context. I want to remind the audience before I start that you can ask a question by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to as many of the questions as possible. But I want to start, and I realize, John, that you spoke about some of the challenges that a dialogue between the United States and other democracies in the world will have in terms of raising human rights concerns. But I want to ask you just to if you were in a situation, and this is for both of you, where you could, part of the Democracy Summit is to kick off a year of action to strengthen democracy globally. And leaders will be encouraged to announce specific actions and commitments for reforms internally to advance the goals of the summit. And in that context, if outside of the ways in which the United States and others may be making recommendations, but if you could see from India and from Indonesia actions and commitments that would advance religious freedom and other fundamental freedoms, what would those be? And how can governments and civil society from around the world who are in attendance encourage India and Indonesia to continue to advance positive change and to certainly uphold many of the principles on which both of these democracies have long resided?
Yeah, that's a great question, and tricky but difficult to answer. With Indonesia, I think a lot of the answers are very technical and have to do with local ordinances and how the country can turn away from this sort of tsunami of local municipalities and regencies passing restrictive laws. But at least the good news is that there are fixes. I mean, those are laws. They can be repealed, they can be overturned, etc. In India, we have a much more challenging problem, which is that on top of the legal problems, the misuse of laws, the fact that there are overbroad laws that can be misused, we have a toxic political atmosphere. And in this respect, India resembles the United States, where many of the things that are occurring that are problematic are not so much the result of official government policy, but are the results of political rhetoric being wielded and promoted that incentivizes or inspires extremist thinking and extremist action and violence. And the fix to that is not necessarily legalistic. It's not a law you can repeal or a law you can change or a new law you can pass or a new policy you can announce, but rather political leadership at the party level, not just at the government level, but at a party level. Sort of political leadership over the BJP as a party, political leadership over Hindu nationalism such as it exists currently in India, where Hindu leaders, from the prime minister to other members of his party, use their political leadership to encourage their fellow Hindu Indians to be more tolerant and less intolerant. I mean, we've gotten to a situation here where, yeah, there are some legal problems. Obviously, I could talk about how we should, in the next year, we could get India to commit to decriminalizing, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, to using the Foreign Contributions Regulation Act less to, stifle dissent. We could talk about those things, and that would be good. And I think the United States could say those things. The United States could say, hey, you shouldn't use this law. It's contrary to human rights principles. You shouldn't use the Foreign Contributions Regulation Act because it puts restrictions on American charities that are seeking to do things in India that we would never put on Indian charities if they were seeking to give money here in the United States. So as a matter of reciprocity, you should abandon this law. We can say all that, but ultimately, the bigger problem is the political one. And that's why I struggle to answer the question. I feel as though if you were to ask, what would you want Prime Minister Modi and his government to do in the next year, it would be more tenuous and less specific. It would be things like, we want there to be less religious violence. We want there to be less prosecutions of critics. We find it absurd that when somebody celebrates Pakistan's victory in a cricket match, they get prosecuted with terrorism. These things need to stop, but you can't really measure this because it's more a question of the Prime Minister pulling back his party from this toxicity. And that's not measured so much by a particular law changing, but by the overall atmosphere changing. I know this is a bad answer. I guess my short answer would be to say, look, we have this year until the next meeting. Also, President Biden hopes to visit India at some point and host Prime Minister Modi again in Washington. And between now and then, we would very much like to see an improvement in the political atmosphere so that this drumbeat of toxicity and violence is lessened.
Thank you. Professor Hefner?
Yes, I think I don't want to sound too upbeat about Indonesia, but I am. And I do think we should distinguish between the scale of the nature of the environment in the two countries, particularly by comparison with India. And I'm not an authority on India, but I do teach on it. I think the differences are striking. Your two mass-based organizations, Muslim organizations in Indonesia, have struck postures on religious tolerance and inclusivity that have very few counterparts among the, if we look at the ruling party in India. Muhammadiyah is a modernist organization. It has, in areas around the country, reached out to the Christian community, particularly where Christians are a minority, and developed collaborative programs that I've done film documentaries on. They are impressive. These are not state supported. They're not state sanctioned. They're run by this 25 to 30 million party member organization. Nahdlatul Ulama, again, a more diffuse organization that has a more socially conservative mass base with 70 to 90 million people, has nonetheless at the leadership level done things like, for the last 20 years, during Christmas season, during Easter season, it has placed its Banzur authorities, militia authorities around Christian churches to protect from attacks. We can dismiss this as significant. It has a profound effect on local relations and sends the message to the Christian community, and I might add the Chinese community, because they have also benefited from these types of initiatives, collaborative initiatives. The Chinese minority, which is about 1.5% of the Indonesian population, has also been very, very appreciative of these efforts. So there are initiatives in civil society, in mass-based organizations, that are huge and that are significant. They're not enough. As in point two, as in many societies around the world, including the United States, one of the unknowns, one of the variables that's most difficult to control is just the actions of irresponsible populist politicians who make appeals to the darker side of human personalities with regard to race and religion for their own ends. In many ways, I would say it's striking that the incidents, I think we have to be careful in our characterization of Indonesia. There has not been a kind of tsunami. There's been a tsunami of some regulation, but not a tsunami of violence. The violence has gone down very significantly over the last few years. And again, in part, it represents the very real work of groups like Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama, in conjunction with the 10%, 9.7% of the population that's Christian, and then the smaller population that's Hindu and Buddhist and Confucian. Last point that I would make, where I think USCIRF and the United States government could make a difference and play a helpful role, it would be to understand what is at stake in Indonesia's blasphemy law. There are different interpretations of the blasphemy law, and it's better perhaps to begin by understanding that in principle, and it's in some, if you will, it's more democratic-minded interpreters presented as a defamation law, which has to do with actual assaults on religious minorities rather than deviation from a majoritarian profession of the faith. The problem with the blasphemy law is that its interpretation has been pushed forward towards a kind of proactive restriction on people, including Ahmadis, Shia, and others, mystical groups, who are seen to profess a variety of the faith, Christian as well as Muslim, that is regarded as deviant from the standard. There's a large constituency of people in Indonesia, and I will underscore, especially in the state Islamic university system, where you have sophisticated scholars of constitutional law and comparative religious freedom, who are themselves committed to religious freedom, that feel that the best tack forward, and I would hope one that the USCIRF might support, is not to attempt a whole-scale abolition of the defamation law, but its reinterpretation in a way so that its effects are limited to actual assaults on religious communities, recognized religious communities in Indonesia, rather than, as it has been in recent years, being applied to, again, people who profess a non-standard, non-normative profession of the faith. Christians, I might add, have been the target of such defamation assaults as well. So there's an area where I think with a very practical focus, USCIRF can make a difference, not least of all by recognizing that there are actors within, especially the state Islamic university system. Ironically, this is where the most sophisticated and open-minded people with the comparative skills and legal skills, legal wherewithal to do this, this is where they're located, recognize that they could do the job and, if you will, restrain the blasphemy law so that it becomes much more limited and less damaging and not damaging at all.
Thank you, Professor Hefner. I really appreciate the urging to think about recommendations on blasphemy laws, and we'll underscore the work that USCIRF has done to really highlight the impact of blasphemy laws around the world. And so we are aligned on that one, and we'll certainly continue to think about ways in which blasphemy laws and their impact can be addressed. I want to ask one quick question just about civil society, and then I'm going to turn it over to Chair Manza and then to the Q&A from the audience. The question I have is about what's happening as John talked about in some of the political terms, but just really the crackdown on civil society and in the context of democracies, and sort of how do you think about the ways in which crackdowns into civil society and the erosion of democracy, what's the relationship between the two, and how do you think about as we move forward the role of civil society in trying to actually again repair, build, try and reverse course on some of the things that you've highlighted that are happening in India and Indonesia. So I just wanted to put that out there. I know it's a different kind of question than what governments can be doing, but it's so important in this time as we think about not only the roles of journalists and documentarians, but also of civil society writ large.
I mean, it's extraordinarily important. What's happening to religious minorities is a mirror or overlaps with what's happening against journalists and civil society and anybody who's seeking to stand up against the government. The freedom to be a Muslim, freedom to be a Christian is one thing. That's about your capacity to embrace your own faith. The freedom to criticize your government and to report on the abuses by your government is another thing. But in both cases, what we're seeing is laws are being used against people who are either protecting their right to exercise their religion or their right to criticize the government. And in many cases, both. So for instance, recently, there have been cases where after anti-Muslim violence occurred in one state, the people who sought to document it were charged with terrorism under Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. And so you have a situation where civil society is doing two things at once. They're seeking to protect religious freedom, but they're also seeking to document human rights abuses. And criticize and petition the government about them. And they're being cracked down, there's a crackdown. A lot of the crackdowns have nothing to do with religious freedom. There are civil society groups in Delhi which have been prosecuted or investigated or audited under other laws. But broadly speaking, there is very much an overlap between what's happening to religious minorities and what's happening to civil society and journalists, media. And that's why a lot of the solutions, legally speaking, and rhetorically speaking, are the same. Because it's not just about toxicity against religious minorities. It's about a general political toxicity where words like anti-national are thrown around that are sort of code words for both Muslim or non-Hindu, but also even if they're not, even if the target is not a professed religious leader, but is simply a journalist or an academic, that it's the same rhetoric, anti-national. It's like you're not part of this. You're not part of this Hindu nationalist ideology that we are seeking to create. That's the toxic ideology that needs to be fought and challenged by other world leaders, including President Biden and by members of Congress.
Professor Hefner, do you want anything to add to that?
Well, as you heard me say, with my examples of Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama, but also the Bishops' Council, Catholic Bishops' Council in Indonesia, the religiously based civil society organizations in Indonesia are alive and well and flourishing, and if anything, are more active and mobilized against what they regard as these processes of sectarianization, to which I referred earlier. More mobilized now than ever. I think there has been significant progress, and it has been supported in most, but not all. As I said, 6 to 7 provinces have politicians who are willing to pay, if you will, the religious card. But in the majority of Indonesia's 32 provinces, by far, these kinds of collaborations across religious divides have been welcome, and they are alive and flourishing. I just finished a documentary film on these kinds of initiatives all across Indonesia. So I think there's a big difference there between India and Indonesia in this regard. The one final point, Indonesia is a complicated place, but the sectarianization, the worst sectarianization initiatives have not been sponsored by political parties, nor least of all the Indonesian state. They have involved in, particularly in the period from 2005, as I said, when there was a coarsening of public relations, they involved Islamist militias launching unilateral attacks on people that they didn't like, including homosexuals, Muslim liberals, feminist groups, and others, and coffee houses where people, were sitting around and perhaps occasionally drinking alcohol. So groups like the Islamic Defenders Front, which goes by the acronym of the FPI, launched unilateral attacks. What's interesting is there has been a significant state pushback, indeed to a degree that some people have expressed concerns that they may be limiting the freedoms of hardline groups. That's something people can debate. But at the very least, it's not been just the state, but again, Muhammadiyah, but especially Nahdlatul Ulama, this mass-based organization, after years of sort of not knowing how to respond to this sectarianization in these Islamist militias, it changed course and decided that it would tolerate their activities no longer. And there have been repeated confrontations, as well as, I said, a continuing commitment of VNU security forces to guard Christian churches during religious holidays like Easter and Christmas. This is, I think, by the standards of Muslim majority societies, and I might add, by the standard of Western democracies, this is evidence of significant progress and goodwill on the part of major civil society organizations.
If I may, I would just add, Professor Hefner has brought up a very interesting, very important point, which is the notion that a majoritarian religious group would use religious freedom as the banner under which to advance their own extremist ideologies. The violence in Tripura was by Hindu groups on the ground who were protesting the government's refusing to allow them to protest violence in Bangladesh. Long story, it's very complicated, but the point is, these Hindu extremist groups that attacked Muslims were angry because the government had prevented them from protesting against violence in Bangladesh. So you see how weird, ironic it becomes, where it twists over and religious freedom becomes the sword as opposed to the shield.
Thank you both. There's a related question, and thank you all, those who have joined us today, for the many questions that have come through. I wanted to, there's a related question in some ways to the one I just asked, that we had also heard from folks about, which is how can US-based civil society groups better draw attention to some of the issues around democracy and religious freedom? And I'm going to ask it for both India and Indonesia, and taking that, understanding the geopolitical and other importance of both of these countries to the United States and that partnership. So just wanted to ask if you had any thoughts for folks here on how they may get better engaged.
Well, there are a broad number of civil society groups in the United States which are engaged on India, some of which are very critical of the government, some of which are very supportive of the government. And we now see a situation in which members of Congress are hearing a plurality of voices from both Indian American, but also just non-Indian American groups that are raising issues about India or attempting to defend India from what they consider to be unfair allegations. So it's a very vibrant, robust debate going on, but all I can say is it's good. And I would say to members of Congress in particular, don't just listen to your constituents, make an active effort to seek out the differing views. The Indian American community is not monolithic any more than the civil society community in the United States writ large is monolithic. There are pluralities of voices, and you should seek them all out and not just rely on, say, one group or another group. Seek the differing voices and make up your own mind.
I'll just jump in here. Here again, India and Indonesia differ in their profile. Here in the United States, Indonesia does not have the large expat community. It has a very small expat community that's taken up residence here in the United States. So we don't have an American-based Indonesian American constituency at all comparable to that of the Indian and in general South Asian community. That said, I would add, as somebody who I once worked with the Ford Foundation on matters of religion and religious freedom and Muslims and democratization, I would say that US civil society and international agencies have done a good job with Indonesia, but regard Indonesia as something of a relative success. People recognize there are challenges, but a relative success, so that particularly with the in the aftermath of the sadly failed Arab uprisings of 2011, much attention of international human rights and civil society organizations based here in the United States shifted away from Indonesia to what was regarded, and I think correctly, as a much more critical area. I think one of the major challenges for Indonesia is much simpler, is that the media and then our government, including USCIRF, needs to continue to draw attention to Indonesia, including applauding Indonesia for the progress that it has made on some fronts, including, as I mentioned earlier today, the extension of greater recognition to religious minorities, that is indigenous religions that previously were not included on the list of state recognized religions. So I think just bringing Indonesia more into the public sphere through reports that are both descriptive and and positive, as well as critical and noting shortcomings, such as in the discussions that are taking place with regard to the blasphemy law. That's, I think, what we need to do. It's Indonesia's doesn't need to be taught; it needs to be just recognized as a partner. in a world where it is ready, Indonesia is ready, and to assume a more prominent international role.
Thank you. I want to turn it over to Chair Manza for a question, and then we will hopefully get one more in from the Q&A and close. So Chair Manza.
Thanks so much. And thanks to both of you, to our guests for this fascinating discussion. I'm sure our guests are appreciating this. Rob, I have a quick question for you. You close your testimony by saying the most problematic actors in Indonesia seem to be the locally based populist politicians. What are things the US government and the international community could do to impact this?
I think we have fewer options than we do in terms of long-term commitments. I think the long-term commitments the United States has shown, and that a number of other international aid agencies such as the Ford Foundations have shown, these have played a huge role. They helped put in place a kind of a Muslim educational leadership by providing PhD programs and advanced training for Muslim scholars, put in place in the State Islamic University system a political and intellectual leadership that made a huge difference in promoting the idea of the compatibility of multi-religious citizenship and democracy with Islam. That is a majority opinion. Now, populist politicians, as we all know, all we have to do is look at contemporary events in Western Europe. This is a very difficult domestic matter for outside agencies to control. And I think the more critical thing is to get in on these small points of leverage where, in a gentle way, in a supportive way, we could urge the Indonesians to do what many of them already want to do, which is to soften and revise, reconstruct the blasphemy law in such a way that it isn't used as punishment against people who who profess non-standard varieties of Islam or Christianity. To me, that single goal would make a huge difference.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to try to get in one more question. What is there's a question about the threshold. Like, when do you think it may get to a point where some of the concerns and violence and persecution that's going on in Indonesia would make it imperative for the U.S. government to go, to actually hold in whatever ways that are available these countries accountable for those kinds of the deterioration of the ways in which religious freedom is being able to be practiced. So I just wanted to ask that question. It's slightly different in the chat, but I'm trying to bring it back to religious freedom, and if there's a sense of when that balance may tip in a different direction from your understanding of the ways in which the United States has engaged on these issues in the past.
John, please.
I mean, there's been a lot of violence. Dozens of people have been lynched every year. Scores of people have been killed. It isn't broad-based systemic violence that rises to the level of crimes against humanity, like in Myanmar, but it is a steady drumbeat, and it is very concerning. And I think there is no hard line, but I think the point to stress here is that India's teetering on the edge of becoming a sort of tinderbox that could explode. With all this rhetoric comes increased dangers of mass violence, not just a vigilante mob, killing a dozen people, which is bad, but isn't, it isn't mass atrocity. It could become that, and that's why this is so scary. That's precisely why this is so scary. I'm glad that Professor Hefner raised, in the context of Indonesia, education, because in both countries, education has been too often hijacked by extremist groups who have sought to, educate youth with a particular, I say educate in quotes, youth with a particular strain of extremist Islam, in the case of some of the Salafist or Wahhabi-inspired mosques that have sought to, promote that at the local level in Indonesia. There are a lot of interesting questions to be asked about where the funding for those schools comes from and whether other countries and the Indonesian government can compete and fund, enough schools to counter it. The similar situation is going on in India at the state level. BJP leaders have formulated educational curricula that are dangerous, that promote, a particular form of Hindu jingoism and extremism that suggests that India is at heart a Hindu country and that its borders, are much bigger than they actually are geopolitically. And these are dangerous ideas, and they need to be countermanded because it's not just about, vigilante violence here and there. It's about the risk of things spiraling into mass violence. And that's how it needs to be thought about, I think, by policymakers here and across the world.
I'll just comment more briefly on Indonesia. As I think you've heard me say today, I think the situation in Indonesia is quite different. The incidents of communal violence have diminished. There has been sustained pushback from these large mass-based Muslim organizations working with the Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, and Confucian communities as well. So that I think the situation of religious freedom, while it's not perfect and the blasphemy law needs to be reformulated, I think the situation of religious freedom in Indonesia has actually improved somewhat from what was widely seen and correctly seen as an existential turning point in 2016, 2017 with the campaign against Governor Ahok. And to the surprise of many people, the Indonesian society and the Indonesian state have rallied, I think, in a very significant way in defense of a multi-confessional, multi-religious citizenship in Indonesia. So I think one thing we need to do is we need to applaud the Indonesians where they, both state and society, Muhammadiyah, Nahdlatul Ulama, have made progress. They have.
Thank you. So we're actually beyond the end of the hour. Commissioner Khan, I apologize for not getting a chance to have you ask a question today. Let me just thank Commissioner Khan and Chair Manza for leading this important and timely conversation on democracy and religious freedom, to John Sifton and Professor Robert Hefner for their wisdoms and their insights. I also want to thank Patrick Greenewalt, USCIRF's policy analyst, Naila Muhammad, USCIRF's senior policy analyst, and Danielle Ashbahanian, USCIRF's supervisory public affairs officer, for putting together this event. And if you would like to learn more about USCIRF's work, there's many things that have come up today that are related to reports and to our country updates that we've done over the past year. I encourage you to visit our website at www.uscirf.gov. We look forward to hosting similar conversations on other countries and issues in the months ahead, and hope that the summit this week is one where religious freedom comes up and is as part of the conversation about in its importance to a thriving democracy. Thank you very much.